Welcome to Old Economy Village. I'm Sarah Buffington. I'm the curator here at Old Economy Village, and I am very proud to present Eileen Aiken English. She has been studying the Harmony Society for a long time. I don't want to say how long, I don't know.
About 25 years.
About 25 years, that's a long time. And she's written several books, including these two. So if you have a copy, she'll sign it for you. This is the Demographic Directory of the Harmony Society. It's a fabulous book. I am opening it almost every day. You like to hear that? And the 1833 residents of Phillipsburg, now Monaca, Pennsylvania. And she would sign either one of these if you brought your own copy. They're also available in our store. What else? She is a professor emeritus from California University of Pennsylvania. And what else should I tell about you? I mean, you're always doing stuff about the harmonies. The schism, we have the schism exhibit right now that's up talking about especially the 1832 schism, but also all the other schisms from the Harmony Society. So that's up if you get a chance to see it. It's going to be up till the end of next year. So, but I would like to turn it over to Eileen.
Well, thank you very much. It's good to be here with all of you. And I usually talk to you about facts or parts of the saga of the society, especially the part where Count Leon comes and he has this big dramatic effect on the Harmony Society, loses all the members. And I thought tonight, instead of just talking about some of those, we talk about members of the Harmony Society. And you know, they were really diverse. They were about as different from each other as you are from your neighbors and the people in your social groups. They are just a really interesting palette, let's say, of people. And each has a story. And as I was doing the research out of which that directory evolved, I was thinking, boy, some of these stories would be great in a book. So that's my current project. I'm working on biographies of some of the seceders, just the ones that also lived in Phillipsburg. So, and that's been evolving for the past 25 years and probably will continue to evolve. But maybe one day I'll get it done. I don't know. Right now it's my hobby. Got some of the stories together of some of the people that I thought were particularly interesting. And some of the people as individuals and then some people as groups. So I thought maybe we would just talk about those for a little bit. So I developed this, and if you'll bear with me, I'm not a whole great big storyteller, but they need to be told like stories because that's how they unfolded. They're just full of drama, all of them. This first one I call Jacob, and little Juditha. And the first Jacob, and he wrote his name with a C, Jacob Sheik. And he and his wife, Magdalena, they met probably at a George Rapp rally over in Germany. And now that I've gotten to know Jacob kind of well, I don't think that he particularly enjoyed going to the rallies. I don't think he particularly enjoyed hearing what George Rapp had to say, but he had his eye on Magdalena, and she was a magnetic person, I'm sure he found. She was a very strong person and very passionate about her faith, and it showed. And he really was probably attracted to that. That's the reason that he asked George Rapp, once they got to America, if he would marry him. And George Rapp, back in those days, they welcomed marriages, they welcomed new babies. They couldn't have enough until a couple years later when they decided celibacy was the better route. So they married, they had a couple of kids. But Jacob was not your average harmonist. I'm sure that you figured that out by now. He was kind of irresponsible. He would never stick with anything very long. He had a hard time focusing. He lost his temper very easily, and he was very quixotic. He could tell you one thing, turn around and tell you the exact opposite. He just was a force, let's just say. he didn't like being in the Harmony Society, and he begged his wife, Magdalena, to leave, and she didn't want to. She really liked being in the Harmony Society. She still loved George Rapp, and Jacob thought he was getting more and more fanatical about what he did. I think he especially thought that whenever he says, we're all going to be celibate now, and that bothered him, but not so much as the whole thing did in general. But Magdalena wouldn't go. They had 2 little children, so when our story starts, the boy, Albert, was 5, and the little girl, Juditha, was only 3, and she was toddling around. One day, Jacob decided he had enough, and he left. He left the Harmony Society and went away and got himself a place to stay somewhere. Not particularly that far, but far enough that he would be out of range of the Harmony Society. Then he snuck into his house one night with a piece of rope. He tied Magdalena up and took her and the 2 children and marched them, I don't know how far, but pretty far, into this place where he was staying. And in his mind, they were a happy family again, but not in hers. And so when she saw a chance to flee, she fled, and she went back to the Harmony Society. Now, Magdalena had a sister in the Harmony Society that had left 2 years earlier, and she married this man who, just like her own husband, did not believe in George Rapp, who felt the same about George Rapp as her husband did. And this man's, now her brother-in-law, his name was Wenzel Gotorva. And Wenzel and the sister Catherine, they got a home in a very remote area. And they were just sort of living there very hand-to-mouth. They never did have a lot of money. But Magdalena just broke off all ties with her sister. And Jacob knew this. And so he thought, when Magdalena left, there he was stuck with these little children. Now remember, very irresponsible. He probably didn't know what to do with 2 children, especially one as young as little Juditha. And so he took them to Catherine and dropped them off. And Catherine at least she took Juditha. Now we don't know what happened to Albert. He seems to have vanished from the pages. And at that point, Jacob also vanished from the pages. So now Catherine and her husband Wenzel had little Juditha. And she was only 4 when she came, and she was there 10 years whenever a visitor came to the door. His name was also Jacob, but it was spelled with a K, and he was Jacob Troutwine. He too had kind of an interesting life with the Harmony Society. He was a little messed up in the head. He was very unable to focus on anything, also very irresponsible. He never saw anything through. He kept running away. They kept having to go and find him. He hardly ever mastered any skills, but when he got to be 21, he decided that he had enough of the Harmony Society, and he left. But he had one step over the first Jacob, in that he was a schemer and a thinker, and a person who wanted really to get ahead, maybe with more than he deserved, but in his head, he deserved it all. And so there was this parcel of land that he'd known about from his days in the Harmony Society when they lived in Harmony, PA. And since then they moved to Indiana. But this parcel of land was just called Haug's Parcel. And the reason it was called that is because a man named Henry Haug had used it as a farm until he joined the Harmony Society, and then he donated it, as he was supposed to. And Jacob really wanted Haug's parcel for himself. So he saw Juditha, and he had asked, how do you come to have a daughter this age? She was 14. And they said, well, she was brought here. She had left the Harmony Society, and he was thinking, I can just hear the wheels turning now. I bet you if I can get Frederick Rapp to give me that parcel if I take her back. Only he wasn't going to do that unconditionally. he wrote this letter to Frederick Rapp, and he said, Judith would love to come to see her mother, and I will bring her, and I will give her to you in exchange for the Haug parcel. And Frederick Rapp, if anybody out-schemed him, oh, they were the loser, because he could out-scheme anybody. He could outwit the worst of schemers, and he saw right through people, and he saw right through Jacob, and he knew that Jacob had something up his sleeve, and probably couldn't turn over little Judith, by then age 14, and but he said, oh, okay, he wanted her to go back to the society, back to her mother, and he probably was finding in his mind, I'm not going to give him that parcel. But he wrote and he said, please bring her for a visit, and we will make a deal when you get here. So before that could happen, though, Mail, keep in mind, they were living in Indiana, and the guitar was somewhere in eastern Ohio. And mail was almost non-existent back then. You might as well say it took many, many weeks for a letter to get to the place it was supposed to go, if it got there at all. So you never could tell, it wasn't reliable. And remember, Indiana wasn't even a state then, so they didn't really even have a postal service in the draw board, so he just trusted the mail. But it did take so long, and meanwhile Judith got pregnant. There went the parcel right out of the picture. And now he had Judith, and now he had to marry her, and now he was settled with a wife, so things weren't too good for Jacob here. So he finally, they went somewhere, they went a lot of places, they moved around a lot. He left her quite often to go somewhere. He never gave her any money, and she had 2 children, and from that point she sort of fell out of the picture. Jacob, however, stayed in the picture. I don't know where he got money, as he seemed that not type to have a job, but he did put his hands on some money, and he invested in money in Phillipsburg, because by then the seceders had come and Count Leon had gone. The New Philadelphia Society that he'd started there was dissolved, and land was just yours for the taking, and believe me, people bought lots and flipped them. I mean, they're like crazy, and they would almost double in price with every sale, and he saw that as a good business opportunity. So he bought land there, never lived there, and he stayed there and paid taxes until 1850. So no house parcel, but he got his land. The next story I'd like to tell you is about the transition from Harmony, Pennsylvania to Harmony, Indiana. Now everybody knows that when they came to the Harmony Society, came to Harmony, PA, they had to build it. They had to carve it out of the wilderness. And when they went to Indiana, the same thing was true. George Rapp had planned to buy land there for years. They had planned on a move. They didn't know where to exactly, but they had a feeling approximately where it was going to be, how big it was going to be, an idea of the kind of town they wanted, and how the logistics of the move to get out there. And they knew that they would have to send an advance crew out of people. And this advance crew was not able to take children because they didn't want to be burdened with having to care for children at that point. They would stay back, the children would. They would continue to go to school and sort of board with relatives. Only 100 people were going to be on this advance crew. And they were all lined up. There were people to quarry stone because Indiana was very rich in limestone, and they needed that for the basements of their big buildings. They had carpenters. They had sawyers to bring lumber to the carpenters. They had farmers who were going to go out. They had women to go out to cook and make a vegetable garden and grow some vegetables. They had a number of other people, just big, strong men mostly, but a big smattering of women as well. 100 people, all in all. And they loaded their boats up to go, the first crew did, in June of 1814. And they were on the way pretty much oh, that day. They were armed with some things, not a lot. They were armed with some supplies of groceries, flour and some lard, a little bit of lard, and some other things that they could use to tide them over, because there was a store there near this property, but it was 15 miles away. But they thought they could make regular trips down to the store and get the supplies as they needed them. The doctor also packed them up some medications that they would need until they would have time. He probably gave them a list of what to buy at the store, at least to order, that they could pick up and have on hand in case anybody got sick. And people were sort of getting sick. There was something going around in Harmony, Pennsylvania, and it was like a little fever. But it would clear up in a couple of days and people would be fine again. And on the way out, some of the people on the advance crew got that way too. They just felt a little under the weather, cleared up. And when they got there, they had some problems. And a lot of the problems were due to the fact that as they got closer and closer to Indiana, the rain started coming more and more and more. They just had a tremendous, tremendous amount of rainfall. And it was just really awful. They got their plan was to build, they called them leaf huts, which were just made out of temporary things, made out of branches of trees, with leaf ceilings on them. You can imagine how porous they were in all this rain yet. But they were going to build houses with sturdy roofs. Well, they got there, and it wasn't as easy as they thought. The rain held them up for a long period of time. And in addition to the rain, whenever the weather was pretty good, they had a hard time getting the materials because the forest was so dense with nettles and all kinds of weeds that they could hardly walk through. And it was painful to walk through because the nettles would get in their clothes and it would get in their hands, and it was hard to work. They were plagued with injuries, snake bites, quite a few snake bites. One guy was bit twice by a snake. One young man developed carbuncles on his body, and a letter described the carbuncles. They had 5 huge ones, and they tried to drain them, but they could tell, they said, this is what the quote said, the decay was already setting in. Now that brings a pretty grotesque picture to mind, but you can see things were bad. But that wasn't the worst part of it. The worst part of it was people started to get sick. Well, it wasn't the same illness that they'd had on the ship and back in the other town. This particular guy, the first guy to get sick, his name was Raymond Schul. And he went into a really deep freeze, and he just couldn't get warm. And when he finally did get warm, they couldn't cool him off. He was sick for a couple of days with this burning, burning, burning fever. He lost consciousness and died a couple of days later. It didn't take that long. And then they started to notice it was not that illness so much. Well, that was plenty, but there were other kinds of illnesses that were coming up too. So they started noticing in people that freezing and the chilling. They started noticing a whole lack of strength. People couldn't even feed themselves or sit up for someone else to feed them. They couldn't focus on anything. A lot of them were comatose. They just moaned and groaned in pain, some of them, and others, they said they had no pain, but they looked very, very healthy, and yet they were the ones that were the sickest. And it was really bad. A lot of the people were down. George Rapp came around and he looked at the people and he wrote, you know, it's so bad here. Out of the 100 people, we only have about 30 that are able to go to church. They had people lying side by side. Well, here's one example. The head of the 100 people that were sent out was Frederick Rapp's second in command. His name was John Baker. His brother Romulus later became the leader of the Harmony Society. But John Baker had this older brother too, named Jacob. They were both sick. They were lying side by side. And John Baker said later, I knew he died, and I didn't have the strength to hold his hand. So they laid there and until someone came for them in the morning. People were so sick They would either fight about whose turn it was to cook, or they would, and all they had was soup. They hardly had any food at all. They had grown beans in their garden. That was probably the only thing they could make soup of, because the other things that they grew were radishes and lettuce. So it's very scant pickings. They had purchased 20 cows. Well, now the 20 cows were giving milk, but there were 100 people to give it to. They weren't able to go to the store for supplies because they couldn't spare the wagon to go. They couldn't build more buildings because they didn't have the work. All they did was just sort of stay there out of the rain best they could, and which wasn't very well, and suffer. So finally, November came, and George Rapp was told, because he knew about the fever, and they said it'll probably pass whenever we get the frosts at the end of October. And sure enough, they did. He sent more crews out. But until then, there were only those 100 people. And of those 100 people during those months, about 13 died. The next year, though, the fever was back again during the summer months and the fall, and they lost 85 people. And some people, they had been hit the year before, but it was an intermittent illness, and it came back on them and killed them the second time around. So it was really not a very good place to be. But through it all, they remained cheerful. And the only person that ever complained was George Rapp. He was blaming the doctor for not sending enough medicine. He was blaming this person and blaming that person because animals got sick. But that was the only complaint that they had. So these people were very strong and very steadfast, and nobody knew about them. That was the trouble. That was always, to me, that was the saddest part. Nobody knew their names. So I was invited to go out to Harmony, Indiana, to give a speech one time, and they put Ray and me up in a little cottage right there at the edge of the cemetery. The cemetery is nothing but a big field, no markers, hardly a tree, hardly any vegetation except grass. And I walked up to the fence, and I looked at them, and I say, I know you're here, and I know what you did, and I know how brave you were, and how you suffered, and no one knows about you or your story. But I'm going to sing your song. I'm going to tell people. And that's why I'm telling you. Now, you're going to be particularly interested if you like R-rated subjects in this next thing, because it's called The Things We Do for Lust. And it's about another man named Jacob. This time it was, no Jacobs anymore. This is Johannes. Johannes Schmidt. Johannes Schmidt probably was a school teacher in Germany. He married a woman over there. They had a couple of children, and they came to America in 1805 and got off the boat in Philadelphia like all the Harmonists did. But once he got off the boat, they needed school teachers in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia was a really nice town. And he said to his wife, no, maybe I could just stay here and teach you. We could have a nice life here. It may have been Philadelphia, maybe they went somewhere else. But anyway, they didn't get to the Harmony Society for 7 years, 1812. And the reason that they came, I think, then is because the town of Harmony, Pennsylvania was being built up. And they were in the finishing stages and saving some of the big buildings until last. So one of the buildings was a huge one. And on one of the floors was a new school, a brand new school that they didn't have a particular building for before. And everybody was very excited. And Johannes probably heard about this and probably thought, well, this is a chance to reunite with the people. And so he took his family and they went to the Harmony Society. And the people there were very, very happy to see them. And they got on and he got a job in the school, teaching away. And whenever the move came to Indiana 2 years later, he didn't have to go. He didn't have to endure all those hardships because he was a teacher. He got to stay back with the children that needed their education. So he was probably happy about that, but he wasn't too happy with another situation. And that is When he left the Harmony Society, whenever they left him to go to Harmony, Pennsylvania, and he didn't, oh, they were people that were looking forward to marriages and having babies and big families. Well, when he got there, they'd adopted celibacy. This was a complete blow to him. And he also didn't like that too much because, you know, he was sort of a guy who was not the celibate type, you know, so not an unfaithful husband, probably a very, very good husband, but still. So he didn't work out too well there, but he suppressed all this. And he wrote later, but I harbored this deep, dark wish. And finally, they left there, they went to New Harmony, and he couldn't take it anymore. And so in 1816, he decided to leave. His family didn't want to leave with him, so he left them and went off in search of love. And as he came along the different pathways, he finally made his way to Miamisburg, Ohio, maybe had a fling or two, I wouldn't be surprised. And he came across this girl in Miamisburg named Catherine Berner. And she was a stunner. She was built, she was pretty, she was coquettish, she was sassy, and he fell for her hook, line, and sinker. And he himself was a pretty attractive guy. And he had a lot of charisma and had a real way with people, including the ladies. And so he must have been very popular there as a single man, but he really would like this Catherine Berner. Well, Catherine lived with her mother, and as time went by, we find out that she was an extremely high-strung person and a hypochondriac, as well as being this gorgeous dresser. The mother was not having any of this business unless they got married, and she made it very clear, you have to marry my daughter. Well, he was smitten with a girl, he married her, and he said it was a huge mistake because he was right on the way to hell. And hell was this mother. She nagged him, she scolded, she mumbled, she grumbled. She did all kinds of things, and he was always the scapegoat. And he got really tired of that. He got really tired of his wife because he wrote later, they made excellent money teaching school there. But she not only spent it all, she drove them into debt because she was always buying clothes, going to doctors for her hypochondria. And he just couldn't take that anymore. And so he prayed. He said, please send me a way, send me an idea that I can find my way out of here. Well, I think he prayed in the wrong direction because the devil got in him. And he thought, aha, I can just see this devious look on his face, this diabolical glow in his eyes. And he said, I know what to do now. He hired a neighbor boy. He was 10 years old. And the neighbor was supposed to come over at night and sit under the window of the mother-in-law and the wife. I guess they shared a bedroom too, and moan. But it was like a lamenting, crying, pitiable moan. Oh, and then they'd be crying. And they woke up, and they looked around, and she said, Johannes, now he knew the kid was there. Wake up, what is that? He probably said, I don't hear anything. But anyway, it went on night after night after night. And finally, they couldn't take it anymore. The women could not take it anymore. The wife took herself to bed, didn't get out of there, and died 9 weeks later. The mother-in-law went off to live in another state. And Johannes wrote back to Father Rapp. He said, I could fill books with the stories that I could tell you about my life with these women. That pretty little whore spent all my money on dresses and on doctors, and I have so much debt, and even though I'm making good money, I have to make more. So here's what I'm making, and if you give me $1,000 more, I'll come back and I'll teach for you. And oh, by the way, I will be glad to contribute my services as your choral director. He says, because your choir is awful. George Rapp never wrote back. And I'm going to call this last one the journey, because we think about traveling on the river as getting from one place to another, and we still do it today. But things were really different back then, travel-wise. And so I thought maybe I'd take a little bit of time to tell you about the trip home. The trip from Harmony, Indiana to Economy was the one I'm talking about. It took place in 1824. Now, by the time that the Harmonists were at that point in their lives, they were very affluent. And they wanted to build a town that was the best on earth, a utopia on earth, one that God would be proud to come and walk through. And that's why they called it Economy, because economy means pretty much the same thing as utopia. So they arranged to have the logistics and everything, and the people came in different groups, but the groups were pretty close together. New Harmony was about 12 miles from the river if you walked. If you took the Wabash River, which really meandered, it was 77 miles. So they walked down to the Ohio River and to catch their boats, and there was a place that they could overnight there. And they climbed into their boats in the morning. Now, I want to tell you that one of these boats had a young man on it, a Harmonist man named Henry Young. And he kept a log of the ship, and the captain helped him with it. And then when he got back, he published it in the paper. And so we have copies of that here in the archive. So I got most of my information from that first-hand account of the Harmonists. But then also I found some accounts of travels on the water from George Rapp and some from Frederick Rapp and a whole lot from other sources. And I thought, well, I'm going to throw some of that in there too. To be honest with you, these people were going upstream. They were battling a current. It took them 2 weeks. But if they were coming down, it would be half that amount of time. They set out in the boats, and they were this particular little group that Henry was in. Henry was on a steamboat. But there was more than one steamboat available for some of this travel, and one of them was this brand new boat called the William Penn, which was made in Phillipsburg by the Phillips Boat Company, which had an excellent reputation. And it was fitted out, it was absolutely posh and brand new, because Frederick Rapp wanted to take the people to Economy, then spiff it up and gear it up a little bit more and use it to bring paying passengers up and down the river as well as cargo. So he had some plans to use this boat a little bit later. It was super, super special, a great big investment. But Henry wasn't lucky enough to get that steamboat. He had to get a little old one, really old, that was kind of broken down and the roof leaked. And he was miserable because there was a lot of rain on the way home. But the rain, it seems like all it did was rain there. But the rain was only one of the weather factors. He also had fog. They encountered a lot of fog. They encountered a lot of high winds. And they encountered a lot of debris floating around in the river. At one point there was a whole tree floating by, and it had its roots exposed, so it must have just been wrenched off the riverbank and just was floating downstream. And other trees that had been lodged somewhere. It was a very rocky bottom there, especially through the part that goes through Kentucky, Indiana. And the limestone rocks are very high out of the water. Well, now there's more water in the river because now we have locks and dams, but they didn't have any back then. And another thing they had to do to encounter, besides the debris in the river and the rocks, were the falls of the Ohio. The Ohio River had this particular point. It was near Louisville. It was called the Falls of the Ohio, but it wasn't like Niagara Falls, one big cascade. It was 3 miles of smaller cascades, and one of them was had an 8 foot, big difference, an 8-foot drop. And that was the hardest one. There was I thought maybe they would have a stationary steam engine like they do up in Portage, Pennsylvania, but no steam engine. They had to do all of this stuff by hand. Now, if you were very lucky and the river was full and the current wasn't too strong, it was only about 4 feet that you had to move the boat up, and you could just pick that up. If you couldn't make it over the falls that way, you had to portage around, and you had to go maybe about 12 miles on foot. It was pretty far, at least according to some of the accounts that I read, because you had to meander through the woods and everything and pass other obstacles, and carrying all of your stuff with you. So they got to that particular point, and they got up over that finally. He said at one point the steam engine took a running leap at the falls. I don't know what they thought they were going to do, how they were going to leap over that. But that didn't work, so they backed it up and took another running leap. And he said, and then finally they stopped. Well, I didn't tell you this part of it. You know, Frederick Rapp liked to save money as much as he could. And so these boats that he rented, he said, we can crew them ourselves. We have big, strong people, and they're very well able, capable of doing anything that they're told to do. We can just do it ourselves. And he was warned, don't go without a captain. You need a captain. You need a captain who knows how to read the current. You need a captain who's experienced, that he knows the river. You need a captain probably licensed in either Kentucky or Indiana, because they required a state pilot to take them through the falls. So, you know, you can crew the boat yourself. Well, they had to get out and do all kinds of work. Sometimes just pushing the boat away from the bank where it had gotten entangled in the roots of a tree. They finally made their way to the Ohio, got over the falls, and were on their way to Economy. They did make it there. They probably made it there in about 7 days. But the funny thing is, not everybody went by the river. Some of them went overland, and these would have been like the herdsmen driving the sheep, the drovers, and the teamsters driving the wagons full of cargo. And they got there at the same time. So anyway, they got to the point where they passed the Pennsylvania line, sailed up, and got to the point where there was Economy. It was in view, and it was sitting on top of this cliff, and it was beautiful, just positively beautiful from the river. And so, as they were required to do, they fired a cannon twice to show they were changing to a traverse course, and went over to the shore. And standing right at the top of the pathway was Peter Schreiber. He said, "Welcome home."